to The Art of Adventure. This is episode 147 with Mark Manson. The Art of Adventure is the podcast that helps you travel the world, run your business, and embark on an epic quest. I'm your host, lead explorer, and guide, Derek Loudermilk. You can head over to the website, derekloudermilk.com, to check out the show notes for this and all other episodes, and sign up for the Art of Adventure reading newsletter, because that's where you get the book recommendations, the podcast episodes, articles, and all the good stuff over there. So today on the episode, Mark Manson is a popular writer, and I've been wanting to have him on for quite a while and finally got him on so we could sit down and talk about his new book. A lot of you sent in questions that you wanted me to ask Mark, and so I got to some of those. And so if you're listening and you find your question being asked, then give yourself a little pat on the back. We covered a lot of really good stuff. Of course, Mark is really well thought out and insightful. He's really well read. He has a lot of life experience. So that, of course, always makes for a good interview. Some of the things we talk about in this episode are Mark's 5 years living out of the country, out of America, and how his thoughts about America evolved over that time. It was sort of a multi-stage process, and we talk about ideas of culture and citizenship around the world. Obviously, we talk about adventure and, the growth of your own identity and how suffering and achievement have an interplay and how they affect our personal relationships as well. And of course, we got to talk a little bit about his internet stalker, which is a fun little story, probably not for him as much as it is for me. So that was a good one. And there's another episode by my friend Dave Buddha. He interviewed Mark on his podcast. That show is called Darken the Page. And I believe that episode is coming out today as well. And in that episode, they dig into more of the skill of writing, because that podcast is specifically for writers. But if you want to listen to both back to back, you can think of it effectively as part two if you want a little more about the craft of writing from Mark Manson. And so, without further ado, let's get into this episode with the one, the only, Mark Manson. Welcome back to The Art of Adventure. Today I have as my guest Mark Manson. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
And Mark is a popular blogger, and he's got a new book coming out, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. And I want to first say that the use of swear word in the title of a book is obviously going to be provocative. So why do you use swear words in your book and in your writing so frequently?
The easy answer to that is just, it's how I talk with my friends. And so I try to write my blog and I try to write my books the same way that, if you and I were just having a beer, and the way I would say it to you then. But I've received so many complaints over the years about my language that I have had to sit down and think about it. And I've decided that I think it does have a purpose, or at least a use. I think vulgarity, it's let's be honest, it's shock factor. It grabs people's attention.
Yeah.
And I think when you're talking about life subjects such as confidence or happiness, self-esteem, things like that, sometimes you kind of need to proverbial grab somebody by the shoulders and shake them while you're screaming at them, stop being miserable. And I feel like the vulgarity helps do that. It seems to grab people's attention or shock them in a way that if I worded things a little bit more PG, wouldn't.
I just watched this documentary, I Am Not Your Guru, about Tony Robbins. and it's incredible emotional roller coaster. But I noticed that he uses fuck a lot when he's talking directly to people because it's a pattern interrupt and it shocks them into paying attention to what he's saying. And I get the sense that whether that's, intended or not, that's what happens. People see that and they say, "Oh my gosh, do I agree with what this guy is saying or not?"
Yeah. Yeah, it forces people to become a little bit more aware. And I've noticed people's brains, I think just the internet shows this in general, is that like people's brains respond very well to like a mixture of information. And so what I found in my work is that if I say something with like a lot of profanity or make a really irreverent sexual joke or something, but then at the same time I'm giving like really good life advice, like really important advice about happiness or whatever, like while dropping F-bombs, people seem to respond to that really, like it sticks better.
It's like subversive almost.
Yeah, it's like it just, I don't know, it's like it sticks in their brain better for whatever reason.
Interesting. I got a chance to listen to an interview you gave recently with my friend Dave Buddha, who's been on this podcast before, and his show is all about the craft of writing. And so I thought I would quickly summarize for the listener what I got out of that, and then they can go and listen to that as a follow-up or a prelude to this interview, because I'm going to try not to ask the same questions. But you've been writing for a while, and sort of like Stephen King, who wrote from such a young age, it seems that you've had all this time to hone your craft, and now at this point you're taking it much more seriously. At the same time, you are spending 3 hours a day writing really good stuff rather than writing for 8 hours, on a long day. And that just sort of, you've introduced a professionalism to your writing as it's evolved. Would you say that's pretty accurate?
Yeah, I used to write for fun a lot when I was younger, and then when I started my businesses, I wrote as kind of like a form of marketing for them. The first few years I had websites, I never, blogging was just something I did to get traffic or drive sales for something else. It wasn't until about 5 years ago that I really got serious about the craft, about, like, okay, how do I get good at this? How do I improve and like bring it to the next level?
Yeah, I think we've seen that over and over again with creative professionals, that's this long journey towards honing the craft, but it's also something that fundamentally you enjoy doing, and it's at its core.
Yeah, it starts out as just kind of like a hobby for shits and giggles, and then it's once you start getting that positive feedback, once you start getting people paying attention to you and telling you that they really like it, that's when you start, at least for me, that's when I started to get kind of serious about it. Started like analyzing myself. So
people, once you got positive feedback, it's like, oh, you like my stuff? I guess I'll give you more of it.
For me, it was just clear. I mean, early in my businesses, like it was clear that I wasn't a very good marketer. I hated sales. Like I hated selling stuff. And the one thing I really enjoyed doing was writing. And people, that was the one part of my business that people responded to. So it wasn't just a personal decision, but it was also a business decision of like, okay, if this is the one part of my business that I enjoy and people enjoy, I should be doing way more of that.
The new book, you call it a self-help book for people that don't like self-help or something like that?
Yeah, I describe my brand or my philosophy is basically self-help for people who hate self-help.
And what are the new ideas you think that come out in this book that aren't available in standard self-help genre?
There's quite a few, actually, and some of them are very contradictory to kind of the conventional wisdom. For instance, I talk about a big part of what I believe and what I write about is basically not believing in yourself, becoming way more skeptical of your beliefs and your assumptions and what you want. always questioning yourself. I talk a lot about failure and the importance of failure. In regards to relationships, I talk a lot about the importance of saying no to people and being comfortable doing that, and also being comfortable hearing no from people in your life. And then it just kind of as an overall theme, I talk about life is full of problems. It's always going to be full of problems. And I think the best approach isn't necessarily to get rid of our problems or live without problems. The best approach is to simply find problems that you like having, find problems that engage you and inspire you, and are making the world a better place.
Pick the right problems.
Yes, choose good problems for your life. Like the difference between a good life and a bad life is a good life has good problems.
Interesting. There's this blogger Ramit Sethi who is always talking about going for big wins, such as getting a large raise at work instead of trying to save a buck here and there. Yep. And it seems somewhat similar vein, pick things that are actually really important to spend your energy and effort dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, the whole concept of not giving a fuck, it's really kind of just a vulgar, veil to talk about people's values or talk about priorities. My experience, I've been doing this about 8 years now, kind of in the self-help world or life advice world. And I really believe that a lot of people who have problems in their life or are suffering in their life, a lot of times, or even most of the time, what it comes down to is just their priorities are out of whack, that they're prioritizing something that is hurting them without realizing it.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I agree with that.
Yeah.
The first thing you mentioned when I asked you what's new in this book is questioning yourself. So what are some good questions to ask ourselves?
The first one is, what if I'm wrong? Because probably are. I have a chapter in the book called Why You're Wrong About Everything. And in parentheses, I say, but so am I. If you just think about, without getting too philosophical into skepticism and everything, if you just think about your own life, if you think about yourself 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if you imagine yourself back then and what you used to think was important or true about yourself, chances are it would make you cringe a little bit now. You kind of shake your head. You're like, God, I was such an idiot. I can't believe I used to be like that. And I think everybody universally experiences that. But what's funny is that we don't realize that everything that we think is important and true now, we're probably going to look back in 15 years from now and have the exact same reaction. We're probably going to cringe and be like, God, what was I thinking? And so I think it's important to kind of always keep that in the back of our minds. Just remember, as we're going about our quote unquote super important life and all these super important things that we're doing, to always have in the back of our mind, the fact that, one day this is probably going to make me cringe a little bit. Yeah. Because there's a lot that I don't understand yet. There's a lot I'm ignorant about. And so in the sense, I say in the book at one point, I say, personal development, growing as a person, it's not about becoming more right. It's just chipping away at your own ignorance. It's becoming less wrong about things. And that might sound like it's the same thing, but there's actually a very subtle and very important difference.
Is that chapter on skepticism, is that the one where you have the story of Erin, the girl you were involved in?
The stalker.
My friend said I should ask you about that.
Oh, man. Yeah, I have. There's a story about, so I talk about certainty a lot and how I've come to believe that pretty much everything bad in the world comes from people's sense of certainty about their own beliefs. And usually those beliefs, it's like a superiority or people just believe the world is a certain way and they refuse to look outside of that. And I have a lot of classic examples, like racism and sexism and political, like fascism, communism, things like this. But it's also, it relates to a personal level as well. And so I tell a story about a woman who cyber stalked me for 7 years because she believed that God had decided that she and I were supposed to be together and that we were destined to save the world together. It is actually pretty much exactly how she put it. And so she harassed me for years. I mean, I probably received 2, 3 emails a day from her for 7 years. And she used to fly out to wherever I was and try to follow me. And it's like really scary and fucked up, but I talk about it. The bad thing about that, it wasn't because I mean she was nonviolent, so I never felt like physically threatened. But like what was so awful about it was just like you couldn't reason with her. You couldn't like I would there were many times like I sat down and like tried to like talk through it. You just couldn't get anywhere. And I've just received so many emails over the years from people who are suffering so much because they think that, my ex-girlfriend, she dumped me 2 years ago and she's the only person I'm ever going to love and I'm never going to love again. And they're so certain of that they actually don't allow themselves the opportunity to grow outside of that. Or somebody will like lose their dream job and they'll think like, crap, I'm a loser. I'm never going to have it as good as I used to. Like it's all downhill from here. And they become so set in that belief that they don't allow themselves to experience anything else. And so you see this pop up in all sorts of things in everyday life. And I think it's just important to keep questioning it. Keep questioning your assumptions. Keep asking yourself, what if I'm wrong? What if this isn't true? What would it mean if this wasn't true? What would that mean for me? How would that change my life and how I see things? And get comfortable with those questions.
Interesting. Yeah. So I have this theory about you and people that are giving out quality advice in general. You lived around the world for many years and you've done a deep dive into psychology and a lot of literature. And what I found personally when I was in grad school and I was working on my thesis, once I had read several hundred academic papers, my brain started making connections and realizations that were like new discoveries. And so I can imagine that because of your exposure abroad and your immersion in literature, you start to have these realizations that seem quite obvious, but don't happen to most people that don't take it as deep of a dive. Is that a correct theory, do you think?
I suppose. It's hard for me to say because I don't know. Like, I don't know what's deep for other people. And maybe what's deep for me isn't deep for other people. And what's not deep for me is deep for other people. But I mean, in my own life, I've definitely always had an attitude. I've always had a very deep curiosity of things, and both in terms of books, but also life experience. Like I've always like just wanted to try everything and experiment with everything. And so, yeah, I agree that it's the more you experience, the more you see, the more you're able to kind of make those associations between things that maybe somebody who hasn't gotten out as much or read as much would never think of.
And when you lived abroad, there was a post you wrote, something like things that Americans don't know about America or something like that. How did it change your perspective on America and the rest of the world?
It's funny. I just wrote out a thing about this for the member section of my website. So I lived abroad for about 7 years. I basically traveled and lived abroad for 7 years. And I would say I went through like 3 kind of stages in terms of like my relationship with the US and how I saw other countries and cultures. So stage 1 I would describe as kind of like just like being overwhelmed. So I would say I would go travel to like 4 or 5 countries. Everything was just so new and so exciting and so different that it was kind of overwhelming. And so I noticed during those first couple of years that I felt like a strong need to kind of come home every few months, just to like kind of like get back into my comfort zone for a little while.
Taking an
like,
America break.
Yeah, just like relax, be like, oh, thank God, Burger King. And so that went on for the first couple of years. And then by like year 2 or 3, I kind of hit this period where I started to like see all the amazing aspects of these other countries I was going to, and all these parts of their culture that they had that we didn't have in the US, you know? So you go to like Southern Europe and you see that they have this amazing appreciation for like food and spending time with friends and family and wine and all these things. And you're like, you're like, God, why don't we have this in the US? Or you go to like Japan and there's just such an emphasis on like politeness and orderliness and like respect. And so you start seeing all these things that you're like, God, like, why doesn't my country have this? And at the same time, you're able to see all like get a lot of perspective on like all the problems in US culture, like all the things that we lack. And so I think during this like kind of middle phase, I was very negative on the US. And that's when I wrote that article. I kind of went on this streak for a couple of years where, yeah, I was just very negative on the US. And I was I was actually like very skeptical that I would ever come back and live here again. And then there was a third phase that I hit, and I hit this around like year 4 or 5, I think. And that was when the novelty of all these other cultures starts to wear off. Like you start to get used to them, and you become just as comfortable in them as you do back home. You start to see all of their flaws and all the things that they lack. And then actually there's some things that the US does really, really well that, you know, say France or Brazil or Japan or Korea, like they don't do well. And so I kind of reached this place where I realized that, you know, every culture is like a double-edged sword. It offers something that is usually very unique and very great, but as a side effect of that thing that culture does really well, there's a dark side of it. There's a negative side of it. And it really just comes down to your personal values. Like how do your personal values mesh with whichever place you live, with both the positive and the negative. And so I moved back to the US beginning of this year, about 7 months ago. And it's actually been really nice. I mean, I'm in New York, which is kind of like not the US, but so it's kind of like its own little country, but it's been nice. I mean, there's still some things that I don't like about here, but it's nice being home.
Do you have a written list of your personal values so you can refer to it and see if it matches up with the country you're in?
I've thought about stuff I don't think I ever sat down and wrote it, but I've thought about that a lot, because that's the other amazing thing about travel is that like it really shows you what your personal values are. So for instance, I never realized, you know, when I lived in the US, I never realized how important like convenience is to me, and until I started living in a few other places. Also like punctuality or just things being kind of organized. It's something that I was never aware, because in the US I'm like kind of seen as like a little bit of like a laid back dude who's like not really like, I'm not type A at all. But I noticed when I started, you know, I went down to South America and lived there for 2 years, and after 2 years I'm like, I can't take this anymore. Like if my internet goes out and I call somebody to come fix it and they don't show up, like I can't fucking take this anymore. Like this is ridiculous. And so yeah, you just start kind of like noticing a bunch of things like that, and like small things too, about different places. So yeah, I've thought about it a lot, but you know, there's no perfect place. There's no place that gets everything right. So you always kind of have to ask yourself like what compromises you're willing to make.
Yeah, I think I read this. There was a contest to write a motto for the United States. It was like, has to be 1 line long, and National Geographic, or I can't remember. But the winning motto was something like, U.S., our greatest critics choose to live here. Or something like that.
That's kind of good, actually. That's pretty good. Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, like if I could just magically like pick a citizenship out of a hat and there were no kind of like real world like repercussions or like bullshit I had to worry about, I would probably, like on paper, I would probably want to be a citizen of like probably some country in Western Europe. Because it's just on paper, the quality of life is higher than anywhere else.
Yeah.
The problem is that when you get into it, like the actual, the reality is that you have to deal, not only do you have to deal with like all the bureaucracy and all that stuff, but like cultural barriers are very hard, language barriers, developing new social networks, developing strong relationships. It's really hard. And it's not that I couldn't do it. It's just that, you know, those things kind of tip the balance for me, I think, at least right now in my life.
Yeah.
Who knows? This could change in 5-10 years. You know,
Yeah.
once Emperor Trump is coronated, you know, maybe I'll be like, you know what? Language barriers sound really easy right now. But that was definitely something that changed for me too. The longer I spent abroad, you know, the first few years I was abroad and I studied some languages and I lived in some different countries. And I kind of had this cavalier attitude of like, oh yeah, I'm just going to pick like the best place to live in the world and I'll just go do it. So my fiance is Brazilian. So I kind of unexpectedly ended up living in Brazil for about 2.5 years. And I speak Portuguese and I've made Brazilian friends and I've lived there long enough. And what happens is that once you actually spend a lot of time in a foreign country, like actually do the expat life, you realize it's really hard. Like even when I go to Brazil now, like it's hard for me to make friends. It's much harder for me to make friends than it is in the US. And there's still like tons of little things that it just like little cultural things that I just don't get, or like I'll be out with a group of Brazilians and you can just tell that like I'm the outsider, even though consciously like there's nothing that I'm doing wrong or that they're doing right, you know, and it's really, really hard. I think it would probably take like at least like 5 years to integrate somewhere.
Yeah.
Completely.
Yeah. It's like, especially when I'm out with a group of Brits or Aussies or something and they think these things are hilarious, you know, especially insulting people. And it's just like, wait, was that the funny part, or you trying to catch up, you know, the whole evening?
Yeah. Like, why, I'm supposed to be laughing? Okay. Yeah.
Let's see. What should we explore next? You have some more contrarian beliefs, such as saying no or positive thinking isn't the answer. Which one of those do you want to dive into?
We could talk about, well, they're kind of related, but we could talk about positive thinking.
Yeah. So one question I wanted to put forward to you, a lot of times people live up to the expectations we set for them, or at least they rise to meet the occasion. So if we set a low bar, then they're, you know, no big deal. If we have high requirements, and they'll live up to it. So, you know, what's the problem with positive thinking and shooting for the stars and all that stuff?
I don't think there's necessarily a problem with having like big dreams and big ambitions. I think the problem enters when we start measuring ourselves by those dreams and ambitions and goals. Because what happens with most people is there's a great article written by a friend of mine. He's another popular blogger. His name's James Clear. And he wrote an article called "The Goal's Not the Point," I think that's what it's called. "The Goal's Not the Point." And I remember seeing that article and I was like, damn, I wish I wrote this. Because it was really good. And it really kind of explains it really well. But basically what he said that often people who, there's a little bit of an irony here. Like people who judge themselves very harshly or think very poorly of themselves, often what they're taught to do or told to do is to adopt very lofty goals for themselves to try to improve and do something great. But then what happens is that they, you know, say they shoot for the stars and hit the moon or whatever. Like they get like 75% of the way there or 60% of the way there. but then it starts to feel impossible. And so they just return to judging themselves and, thinking that they're a loser because now they're not accomplishing these goals. And what James said in this article, which I thought was great, is he said, look, the goal's not the point. The goal is simply a tool to get you off your couch and going and doing something and pursuing something. The problem is that I think big goal setting and a lot of positive thinking kind of exacerbates with some people is that it encourages further judgment, self-judgment. And that is actually usually the root of the problem.
Mm. When I talk about adventure, a lot of times I see it as a means to growth. Instead of having some sort of traumatic event that we have to deal with and then rebound and become stronger and grow, we can choose these sort of ecstatic, joyful quests that are also equally challenging that we can go on and, battle through and grow. What are your thoughts around, does someone have to suffer to grow, or can you also experience growth through like a large challenge that you set for yourself that you actually, a big goal?
Well, I do think suffering is required. I think what you're talking about is just the context of that suffering. So, if I decide for myself that I want to go climb Mount Everest and I go out there, obviously I'm suffering. Like somebody might go climb Mount Everest and come back and say like, that changed me. Like I'm a different person now. And a big component of that is the suffering that they went through. But that is, as you put it, like it's a joyful suffering because and I think that's why humans pursue these kind of seemingly crazy things, is because there's a certain amount of joy found in expanding your identity or what you believe you're capable of. Similarly, I think, when something traumatic happens, like say the death of a family member, this also changes people. And again, I think it's the suffering. But I think the suffering isn't actually like the point. The suffering is just the side effect of the change that occurs in how we see ourselves and how we see our values in the world. So like if you go climb Everest or something, the change doesn't actually, like the mountain's not actually responsible for you changing the snow and everything. Like it's what's responsible for you changing is that you are being confronted with all of these challenges that are way beyond what you used to believe you could handle. And then you're actually able to handle them. And so that changes your perception of yourself. And that's what's life changing about it. But the suffering is required to do that. Like if you think about it, any change requires you, by definition, any change requires you to become uncomfortable. Typically, the more uncomfortable you force yourself to become, the greater the change will be. So I see it, adventure as just, it's a very like consciously directed way to create that discomfort in yourself, to create like a context where you can push the boundaries of how you understand yourself. And yeah, the result of that is usually a joy or like a great feeling of accomplishment or a great pride. So the process is the same as trauma, but because of the context, because trauma is something that you don't choose. It's something that, suddenly your father dies. It's like you choose that, you didn't want it, you weren't prepared for it, but you're forced to go through it. Whereas like adventure is something that you consciously choose it, you prepare for it, but you still suffer.
Yeah. Do you think that we should seek out romantic partners who've been through a lot of suffering because then they'll have been changed and whatnot?
Not necessarily, because just because somebody has suffered a lot doesn't mean that they've learned to handle their suffering well. In fact, there's been studies on victims of trauma, people who have had like big traumatic episodes in their life. And what they find is interesting is that a small percentage of them actually kind of grow and become better for it very quickly. And they often say like, wow, that was actually one of the most like profound things that ever happened in my life. And then everybody else either struggles with it for a long time, or things get much worse. And so it's a very complicated question. But I would say what I would look for in a romantic partner is I would look at how does he or she deal with their problems. Are they good at dealing with their problems? Are they good at dealing with their suffering? Because getting good at dealing with suffering is a skill that you can develop and you can practice. And I think there's probably a very direct correlation between how well you are at dealing with your suffering to how emotionally healthy and successful you go on and become in your life.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Which of the parts of this book or your own advice do you have the hardest time following?
That's a good question. I have not been asked that yet. I still struggle with, so there's a chapter on boundaries, but I believe it's called The Importance of Saying No. Mm-hmm. I still struggle at times with standing up for myself or kind of putting my foot down and saying, like, I do accept this, I don't accept this, and also being able to hear that from other people. I think it's just, and part of this is just kind of the family I come from. Like, this has always been my weakness. I think it still is I just, even though I'm so much better at it now than I was 5-10 years ago, I could still be much better at just kind of speaking up and letting people know where I stand, both in terms of like things I like, things I like, like telling people like, wow, I think that's great that you did that. I think, and also standing up and saying like, wait, no, that's not appropriate. That's something I could still work on.
Yeah. That's, makes me immediately think of Martin Luther King, for example. He is such a rare individual, and yet I'm sure a lot of people were feeling someone needs to stand up and say this. And then he was the one person that was like, well, I guess that's me.
Well, and the funny thing about him is that apparently he had a complicated family life. Like he was unfaithful, and like, not that there's anything wrong with like non-monogamy, but I mean, it's like, I think he's an interesting example because he was extremely good at it in like a leadership way, like a political leadership way. Mm-hmm. And you see this a lot with people. Like a lot of people are fantastic at this type of stuff in like their personal life, but you put them in like a work environment. Like there's somebody that I'm acquainted with that I'm thinking of right now. She is fantastic at like, just like in her personal relationships, like family relationships, just like cutting the bullshit, getting to the point, saying whatever's on her mind and just kind of clearing the air of everything, and if you're kind of like, if I'm like thinking something, like I'm uncomfortable with something, but I'm not really saying it, like she'll notice and she'll be like, why are you uncomfortable? Tell me what you're thinking, and wow. She's excellent at that. In a work context, she's like, her coworkers think she's like a raging bitch because she's like just constantly confrontational and probably too confrontational. So you get people who are like good at this stuff in one context and not the other, They can say it to their friends, but you put them in front of their parents and like all of a sudden they get really like quiet and passive aggressive.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about that a lot when I'm thinking about self-confidence and how it's so domain specific. Like you could be really good at video games, but not confident when it comes to talking to members of the opposite sex, for example.
It's a very common one. It's a very confident domain dichotomy. I speak as one who used to have both of those.
What haven't I asked you about that you want listeners to know?
I can't really think of anything. The book comes out September 13th. It'll be in bookstores. It'll be on all the online retailers and whatnot. Buy it if you like these ideas.
Yeah, so I just finished the book for this interview, and I really appreciated it. I think it's in science. We have what's called a literature review. Basically, that's where you start, and they've gone and read a couple hundred academic journals, and then condensed it down into 5 simple paragraphs for you to read and you're like, oh my gosh, this is great. And I feel like that's what your book is. It's a very clear condensation of a lot of ideas from a lot of places.
Yeah, it definitely felt like that writing. I think it's about half as long as the first draft started. So
wow. Yeah, how long did it take you to write?
It was kind of a rocky process. So I started it early 2014, but then it was very on and off with it. And then by the end of the year, I kind of finished the first draft, but it was just the first draft was extremely bloated and way too like philosophical and rambly. And so I spent a lot of the beginning of 2015 kind of like just figuring out how to condense it, like what parts needed to be cut, what parts can be put together. That's the period too that I went and got a publishing deal. So I got an editor who was able to kind of like help me sift through everything.
Did you seek out publishers, or did they come to you, or how did that work?
They came to me initially. Well, agents came to me, and I was eventually persuaded to go the publishing route. And then with my agent's help, we went and sought out publishers. So yeah, with the help of my agent and my editor, we kind of like sifted through it and figured out like the handful of things that were the most important to focus on. And so then the summer of last year, I kind of just rewrote and condensed everything to what exists now. And that took just a few months to do that. And then the editing process obviously took a couple months as well. So
yeah, big adventure.
Yeah. It's weird to like, I mean, I think it's going to be weird for me like probably next year, like once all this stuff kind of dies down and I'm not like doing interviews anymore or promoting it anymore. It's probably going to be really weird for me because this has basically been like, by that point, it will have been like a 3-year project that will kind of be behind me. And I don't think I've ever like worked on one thing for that long before.
Yeah,
but
it's amazing.
It's like I'm sure there'll be like a little period of like, what the fuck happened? Like it's over. What the fuck am I going to do with myself?
Now I'm 3 years older.
Yeah, exactly. Like, okay.
Mark, I usually ask a couple questions at the end of all my interviews. One is about adventure. We kind of dived into that already, so I'll just ask the second one. And that's, if you could change or add anything to the world, what would you wish for the world to have?
Oh my God, man. That's I don't know. I feel like Miss America, but like in world hunger. Like it's I don't know. I mean, one thing about traveling so much is you do see it's pretty mind-boggling, like how large of a percentage of the world like just lives in horrible poverty. And then how much of another percentage of the world like lives in just a very corrupt, dysfunctional society. So yeah, I mean, it sounds super cheesy, but yeah, I mean, like, let's start with feeding everybody, and we'll go from there.
All right, yeah, I love it. Mark, you already said about the book, but where can people find you online?
markmanson.net. And check out, I've got a link for some of my best and most popular articles. So you can start there. And if you like the articles, buy the books, subscribe to the site, keep in touch.
Perfect. And first of all, thanks for coming on the show. And also thanks for doing all this hard work and all this thinking and your version of suffering so that we can learn from you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, man.
All right, there you have it. Mark Manson, everyone. What did you think of that interview? Did you agree with everything that he said? What did you learn? Is there something that he said that you are going to apply in your life, or that just made you think, maybe I'm going to approach something differently from now on. If you want to let Mark know what you learned, go ahead and send him a tweet. There'll be a link in the show notes to his Twitter, or you can easily find him. He is real popular on Twitter. And don't forget to subscribe to The Art of Adventure in iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you listen to podcasts. Maybe you're on Spotify. Make sure to check out Mark's book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. It's really good, and I'll probably reread it a couple of times because it's so thoughtful that you kind of need to let it sink in. And that's the sign of a book that, for me, is challenging, and it's going to give me a lot. I really appreciate those kinds of books. Great news! I've got a book coming out soon. It's called Conductors. I'll be starting pre-orders in 2 weeks. That's October 1st. 2016. I've got a campaign on my friend's platform. It's called Publishizer. Anyway, we're trying to get 250 pre-orders so that we can approach a publisher and use that as leverage to get the book published. So I'm going to be sending an email out to you guys if you're on the email list. If not, I'd love for you to subscribe, and I'll send out a couple of samples, the introduction probably, and a chapter from the book that you can check out. And then if you like it, then hopefully you'll decide to pre-order the book. Anyway, more on that as we get closer to the time. That's all for today's show. So thanks so much for listening. It's your turn to go out there and be adventurous.